Less than 100 years ago, the British ruled a quarter of the globe and 1 in 5 of the global population. The British Empire was the biggest there's ever been. And even though it's long gone, its powerful legacy remains. It used to be the case that people were happy, proud even, to declare themselves imperialists. But now, across great swathes of the world, that sounds like a badge of shame. In this film, I'm going to examine not whether the empire was a force for good or for... Jeremy Paxman explored that theme in 2012. He looked at how some imperialists had tried to exploit the idea of a master race.
In 1863, the members of the Anthropological Society of London gathered to hear what was billed as a scientific lecture. It was a momentous and, as it turned out, hugely controversial occasion. The speaker was the president and founder of the association, Dr. James Hunt. The title of his paper was "The Negro's Place in Nature." I propose to discuss the physical and mental characteristics of the Negro, with a view to determining not only his position in nature, but also the station he should occupy. I shall also dwell on the analogies between the Negro and the anthropoid apes.
What followed was over an hour of racist nonsense dressed up in the pseudo-technological language of scientific observation.
The skull is very hard and unusually thick, enabling Negroes to fight or carry heavy weights on their heads with pleasure. There were hisses and boos from the audience, but his ideas struck a chord among more fanatical empire builders. Because the empire had been such a huge success story, they began to talk about how they had, and this phrase was pretty widely used, a genius for empire. But what was this genius? It got muddled up with Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution. The champions of empire argued that the British had evolved naturally to rule over others. Everywhere we see the European as the conqueror and the dominant race, and no amount of education will ever alter the decrees of nature's laws. In 2012, such views, of course, sounded not just offensive, but ridiculous. It's hard to believe that even in the heyday of empire, ideas like that were taken seriously.
Let's not get too, with the benefit of hindsight, judgmental. But yes, I mean, there was social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. You've got genetic theories emerging. And there is scientific racism, definitely. You know, that's part of the mix, the intellectual mix. But there was certainly a sense in the air that, you know, the British were the top nation. If you look at the coverage of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, in American newspapers, there was one editorial which was saying, you know, we must acknowledge that the British are in charge of the world. They are the kingpins.
The movies and television have, I would argue, pretty much defined our image of the empire as it was in its Edwardian heyday. It's those crazy bright red soldiers' uniforms and solar topies. It's the world of ripping yarns, of carry on up the Khyber, of Corporal Jones and his fuzzy wuzzies who don't like it up 'em. In one sense, it's made the whole thing appear a bit comic.
That sort of humour is something that we relate to. The whole idea of sending up a figure in authority or someone who's quite self-important and is a big cheese, as it were, that's something that's quite British.
But as I've learnt on my trawl through the archives, there are some subjects that provoke argument, not laughter. And Britain's record in India, the jewel in the imperial crown, is one of them. The BBC's 1972 series on the British Empire was one of the most ambitious history series ever made. This 13-hour analysis of the empire took 2.5 years to complete. It cost the then huge sum of £500,000 in an era when the Prime Minister was paid £20,000 a year. In one episode, filmmakers tell the story of the 1919 Amritsar massacre, a seminal event which hardened sentiment against British rule in India.
Amritsar, in the Punjab, the holy city of the Sikh religion. In 1919, it was to be the inappropriate setting for a historic moment of violence, which would detonate a prolonged struggle between the British Raj and Indian nationalists for control of India. The Punjab had always been one of the most loyal of provinces. It supplied over half the Indian Army's recruits, but in 1919 its cities were torn with rioting born of post-war discontents. There were attacks on Europeans and on government buildings. A town crier was sent round the city by General Dyer, the local British commander, to announce that all public assemblies were banned. A large crowd gathered in this park, the Jallianwala Bagh, on the 13th of April, 1919. General Dyer, with fewer than 100 troops, called on the crowd to disperse. It failed to do so. Unknown to Dyer, this narrow alley was the only exit from the Jallianwala Bagh. General Dyer said later, "I fired and continued to fire until the crowd dispersed. I consider this is the least amount of firing which would produce the necessary moral and widespread effect." 379 people were killed and 1,200 injured. The wife of the Assistant Commissioner recalls what happened after the shooting.
General Dyer came in looking very sad, and we gave him a drink. And then he said, "I'm for the high jump, but I've saved you women and children."
Swift retribution. That was how the Raj had always maintained its authority. But at home, the sentiment which prevailed was of horror and outrage. For post-war Britain was liberal, humanitarian in its climate of opinion. Dyer was disavowed by the government and sacked.
This story of the massacre recalls perhaps Britain's most shameful act during the Raj. And the filmmakers seem to underline that sense of shame once the Raj had ended in 1947.
This was once the mansion of Lord Clive, the first Governor-General of British India nearly 2 centuries before. The Honourable East India Company, the Empire of India, Governors-General, Viceroys, King-Emperors, all was over now. The British had said farewell at last, and India had returned to herself. Once these pillars had proclaimed a conqueror's pride, now they served to dry the hand-moulded cakes of cow dung, which are the staple Indian fuel. Eternal India's epitaph for an empire.
For some viewers, the film seemed to mock the very idea of empire. A former official of the Raj, Lord Ferrier, launched a debate in the House of Lords, which unleashed fierce criticism of the BBC.
In the official record, Hansard, there are pages and pages of complaints. The Lords, many of them quite elderly, turned out to be the most critical audience imaginable.
I was brought up in the Victorian era, when discipline, patriotism, and the establishment were all respected. Today, apparently, they're dirty words.
The BBC was compared to Lord Haw-Haw, the radio propagandist for the Nazis during World War II.
We tend to think by 1972 the empire was over and that was, a new era in British politics. And of course, to some extent it was. But historical memory doesn't die immediately. A lot of the people who were objecting to this in the House of Lords and so on had lived through it, had worked in it. Many British families had spent not only their lifetimes but generations working in the empire. It was still a very live political issue for people at that time.
The irate politicians would have been astonished to learn what had been going on behind closed doors at the BBC.
The series almost didn't make it to the screen. The rows backstage, inside the BBC, about what to say about the empire were the same as those raging outside among historians and politicians.
According to one of the producers on the series, then in his 30s, the BBC wanted to glorify and celebrate the empire.
But the young producers were having none of it. They even talked about resigning en masse before they got their way, to tell the story, warts and all.
The empire is still an incredibly political thing to discuss because its echoes are still with us so strongly. It still affects so much of the world today. Certainly if we're talking about, say, the Middle East, parts of Africa or South Asia, there is the British Empire at the root of a lot of those problems. Of course, those political situations have evolved since the end of that empire. But part of what we now know as current events is rooted in that history, so it is still incredibly political for many people.
More than a quarter century after that row over the Empire series, India was still a controversial topic. In 1998, Timewatch invited one of our best-known historians to argue the case for the benefits of British rule.
It was during the Queen's visit last year that the British rule in India was once again brought to the world's attention. There were calls for the Queen to apologise for the Amritsar massacre in 1919 and implicitly for 2 centuries of British colonial rule.
How should we assess the British Raj? Is it an episode of which we should be proud, embarrassed or ashamed? Andrew Roberts highlights what he believes to be historical myths of British rule in India.
The viceroys, whose effigies are carefully preserved in a secluded estate outside Calcutta, governed the country with foresight and wisdom. English prevailed as the language of the law and of the administration, helping to unite as a single nation the once disparate peoples of the subcontinent.
The young men of the Indian Civil Service came out here to dedicate their lives to the teeming multitudes of India. They did so with fairness and decency and astonishingly little interest in personal gain.
The building of over 40,000 miles of railway track connected the country in a way never before possible. Of all the enduring achievements of the British in India, this railway system was one of the greatest. Throughout Britain's dominion over India, the British military establishment was tiny. It rarely numbered more than tens of thousands in a country of hundreds of millions. If our rule here had really been tyrannical, as is now made out, it could never have survived with Indians outnumbering Britons by 1,000 to 1.
Sir Winston Churchill, a great servant of the Raj, thought it Britain's greatest achievement. He was right. And rather than apologise for our record here, we can and should be proud.
First of all, what's your overall attitude to his proposition?
That is sneering, snivelling, supercilious and silly. It's unhistorical and totally unworthy of a history don.
Turning to you, Patrick French, do you take Andrew Roberts' view that it was a benevolent kind of government?
Well, I mean, it's like Manishankar said, it's such a grotesque caricature of what actually happened that it's hardly... I mean, I honestly don't know where to begin, to be frank. I'm startled that he could have made a film saying some of the things that are in there.
Does it disturb you at all that Hitler admired what the British had done in India and, in fact, used it as an example when he was wanting to to march into Russia to say that, in fact, this was his India.
And
Does that not disturb you dreadfully?
Of course not. Look what he did in Russia. He did the absolute opposite of what the British did in India. He depopulated, he killed people completely arbitrarily. The absolute opposite of what we had done for a century. I think that just because Adolf Hitler is said to have admired the British Empire, I mean, he admired Wagner. Does that mean we're never to listen to Wagner?
That lively exchange took place half a century after the British quit India. One result of their leaving was the partition of India, with disputed territory like Kashmir still the cause of bloodshed today. Filmmakers have consistently returned to the events of 1947, as historians constantly reassess the roots of the tragedy.
On the 60th anniversary of partition, the BBC showed just how bitter the conflict had become.
In British India, the 255 million Hindus were in a majority. India's 92 million Muslims were concentrated in the northwest and northeast of the country. The 6 million Sikhs lived mostly in the Punjab, one of the richest and most diverse provinces in India. Muslim fears that Hindus would dominate an independent India drove the demand for a separate Muslim homeland. With religious hatred and suspicion growing, the dream of a united India seemed to be falling apart.
The task of managing the handover had been given to Earl Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, and he was in a hurry to get the job done.
At a press conference, Mountbatten dropped a bombshell. Britain would not be leaving in June 1948, as had been planned, but on August 15th, 1947, just 3 months away.
The whole problem was that Mountbatten tried to do this job in too short a time. To expect a country to be partitioned, a new country to be created, and within 2 months, everything went out of control.
It was no question of it being too soon. It was much too late. Because, in fact, when he arrived, he saw the situation was so much more volcanic than he'd been led to believe in England.
Communities that have lived together for centuries turn on each other in one of the worst communal massacres of the 20th century. Britain, the once great colonial power, looks on as India burns.
Hindus and Muslims were in the grip of madness, lunacy.
In the coming months, around 15 million people made the journey from one side to the other. At least 1 million were dead. Thousands more lay abandoned in makeshift refugee camps, stuck on the wrong side of the border. In only a few months, India had been divided along religious lines. The Indian part of the Punjab was cleared of nearly all its Muslims, while Pakistan was emptied of most of its Sikhs and Hindus. The border, created in 1947, would become the focus for 3 wars and 60 years of animosity between the government of India and Pakistan.
There was very much at the time, and certainly looking back, a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. There were some senior British politicians in government who would have liked to have stayed for another 15 years to make the handover more successful. But of course, nationalist politicians, quite rightly, want the power now.
Amelia's story revived to meet a significant anniversary. Yet even then, they serve a valuable purpose in outlining the key moments of history for a new generation. I've seen how the imperial legacy in Africa and India has been the subject of often controversial filmmaking for many decades. Cecil Rhodes appears to have few defenders. while the motives of the Masters of the Raj were mixed, and that's borne out in the television archive. But in another part of the empire, the motive of the Masters was quite clear, and their methods despicable. An episode of the 1972 British Empire series looked at how for 200 years Britain drew riches from the Caribbean, using enslaved Africans.
It took 3 years to break an African tribesman into an efficient field slave. It was known as the seasoning period. 1 in 3 of the slaves died during seasoning, of disease, overwork, ill treatment, and suicide. They worked from dawn to dusk, with a short break for breakfast and a longer one at midday. Though the work in stifling cane fields was back-breaking, crop time seemed the best in the year to the slaves. Then at least they could stave off hunger by chewing cane, and they were even given rum to keep them going. Slaves were expendable. The planters reckoned it more economic to import new slaves from Africa rather than prolong the life of those they had by better treatment. The life expectancy of a slave was 7 years.
Eventually, after decades of campaigning, the abolitionists won their moral crusade against slavery.
In 1833, the reformed House of Commons decreed the end of slavery in the British colonies. In the West Indies, 500,000 slaves rejoiced on the great day.
In 1972, filmmakers largely accepted that the slaves were freed on moral grounds. Since then, some historians have suggested that slave rebellions and cold economics also played a role.
Industrialization is far more productive than having slave labor. It's not a humanitarian thing. People work out that slave labor actually isn't that productive. You've got to feed them, you've got to look after them when they get sick, you've got to house them. And actually the industrial system, if you like, where you pay people and then they look after themselves in theory or are not looked after, was far more productive and profitable.
The film appeared in the early 1970s, at a time when Britain's relationship with its former colonies was hotly debated. Although the sun had finally set on the empire, there remained the legacy of those imperial citizens who claimed their rights to settle in Britain, which many regarded as the mother country.
Immigration was the big issue, and filmmakers in the 1970s began to ask whether high levels of immigration were desirable, and also if those who came were getting a fair deal.
There have been blacks in Liverpool since the 1770s, a consequence of the shipping trade with West Africa. In those days, black slaves could be bought in Liverpool. Later, African seamen settled here, and then in the 1940s, the wartime government recruited West Indians to work in British factories. For generations, these black men have married and lived with white women, producing a half-caste community that is British by birth and Afro-British by race.
What's life like in this estate?
It's all right, you know. I've got friends with the woman next door. Some people are all friendly in the neighbourhoods, but the woman next door is very friendly, you know.
Is she white?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's white.
But locally born Liverpool blacks want more than neighbourly tolerance. They want equality of opportunity, a fair share of whatever jobs this depressed area has to offer. According to race relations workers here, many Liverpool employers have discriminated against the black community for so many years that the practice has become an accepted fact of life. Even in its better days, Liverpool has always had twice the national rate of unemployment, and always the blacks have found themselves at the end of the queue.
There's got to be a policy of positive discrimination. They've got to come forward and they've got to allocate jobs to black people. They've got to recognise that black people exist and black people need to be catered for. Kids 17, 18, 19, they have a right to say, what is this white society doing for me?
Filmmakers were keen to explain, in the simplest terms, the new law to protect the rights of immigrants, which had just come into effect.
It's an attempt to change people's attitudes. Take employment first. This man is after a job for which he's qualified and which he knows exists because he's seen it advertised. He applies for the job, but the employer turns him down. That rejection could be against the new law. An employer may not refuse a man a job or deny him promotion or pay him less simply on grounds of race. The same man is now looking for somewhere to live. He goes to a boarding house and he asks for a room. If the owner turns him down, apparently on grounds of race, he can take the owner to court. The law applies to hotels. Indeed, it's now unlawful to deny a person any goods or service on racial grounds.
Whatever the law said, not all of the recent arrivals felt welcome in Britain.
It's now 25 years since Commonwealth Asians first came to Britain in sizable numbers. At first, the men came alone, uncertain whether they'd stay. But later, most of them sent for their wives and transplanted their roots and their culture. And now there's a second generation of British Asians that knows no country but this.
The British don't accept me because they say, although you possess a British passport, and although I've lived all of my life, almost all of my life in this country, they will not accept me.
We are stuck, in a sense, between the two cultures, the Western and our own culture.
The old Jewish quarter of Whitechapel, now occupied by one of the least favoured immigrant groups in Britain, the Bengalis of Bangladesh. The parts of Bangladesh they come from are among the poorest in the world. And they face bigger problems of adjustment to British society than any other immigrant group. The result is tension and sometimes violence.
The window has been broken and went upstairs. When they threw the bricks, the glass went everywhere in the room, and the baby was sleeping in the cot, and baby had bruise in the face, marked.
Two men may be set in the top, and one is putting the knife in cut this that way.
In 1994, using newly released official papers, Timewatch explored the history of immigration from the former empire. In an episode which resonates today, politicians apparently underestimated how many people would take the opportunity to settle in Britain, causing concern in some communities.
By the early 1960s, some of those who lived in the communities where the black immigrants had settled felt emboldened to speak their mind.
Well, it's no good for folks saying as people will mix, they just won't.
They're a nuisance at work, they won't work. And for folks who got them living by them, they're a more nuisance still.
I think they should live in a district all to themselves, because I've got to bring this little boy up amongst them.
The problem arose from a miscalculation made in the late 1940s.
British subjects numbered nearly 800 million people. From whichever country they came, they had the right to work and settle in Britain, a right enshrined in the British Nationality Act of 1948. It was assumed that only a few of those subjects would actually exercise their right. But with the passing of the new act, the children of the empire began to come home. Leaving behind poverty and unemployment, they were hoping for a better tomorrow in Britain.
Timewatch revealed how quickly the policy of open-door immigration was called into question and how the whole subject became mired in politics.
Official documents that have recently been the subject of academic study reveal that within months of enacting the 1948 Act, the authorities were already alarmed by its implications. In April 1954, a meeting was convened to build a case for legislation intended to withdraw the automatic right of abode in the 1948 Act. In November 1961, amidst heated debate, the government introduced a bill to limit immigration from the old empire.
Despite those first measures to control immigration more than 50 years ago, the subject remains very much alive. As recently as 2012, filmmakers were able to demonstrate just how firmly shut the once open door has now become. The children of those who would once have claimed an entitlement to enter Britain face a treacherous journey and a cold reception.
Illegal migrants from India trapped in the UK without a home, work, or even an identity.
They pay people smugglers thousands of pounds, yet sometimes end up penniless and destitute.
Punjab, one of India's richest states. They call it the food basket of India. In the first decades after independence, hundreds of thousands of mainly Sikh Punjabis settled in the UK to fill huge gaps in Britain's workforce. Today, the criteria they must meet for a British work visa is much tougher. Agents charge up to $15,000 for a visa and the services of traffickers. There are no refunds. This is Southall in West London. It's home to a huge South Asian population, one of the biggest concentrations outside India. Over the last 20 years, illegal immigrants from India have added to that population. But for new arrivals, life here is tough. From sunrise, hundreds of illegal immigrants descend on the train station car park, a regular pickup point for cheap, illegal labour. A lack of work is pushing illegal workers into the very poverty they hope to escape. They live here, in Britain's 21st century slums. Across Southall, 2,500 poorly constructed buildings, hidden at the end of suburban gardens. They call them sheds with beds. Many built without planning permission, others converted garages.
This is just one street, and on the end of each garden there are brick buildings like this one, all with windows and doorways leading to this alleyway, and they just go on and on and on.
Increasing numbers of illegal immigrants are giving up on their life in Britain. But getting home isn't easy.
Of course, many millions of Commonwealth citizens have come to Britain and thrived here. The nation that 70 years ago offered an open door.
The world we live in today is a consequence of empire. My parents were from Ghana, or the Gold Coast as it then was. They wanted to continue their education in what was even then called the mother country, the kind of seat of empire, if you like. I mean, I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the British Empire.
Delving into the Empire archive has reminded me of one important principle. History can never be entirely objective. Historians and filmmakers must select which facts to work with, how to interpret them, and therefore the message they convey.
There is a particularly robust debate in Britain about empire and about our supposed heroes or villains of our history. Now there's actually a great fashion for people saying it wasn't that bad after all. That's been going for some time, and then there's a counterbalance to that. But I think this is all part of a healthy debate. You wouldn't want to restrict what points of view people were allowed to take.
I've seen how, in the 1970s, filmmakers were keen to expose the excesses of empire. Fast forward a few decades, and in two more recent high-profile series, their authors take a much more benign view, at least giving empire builders the credit for a noble enterprise.
The men and women together.
The film recognises that those noble aims were only partially achieved by the time Britain decided to call it a day.
In 1947, when India, where they were interned like so many forlorn hostages to that old joker, history. But perhaps the last word on the British Empire hasn't been written after all. At least if that empire is thought of not in terms of scarlet tunics and flashing sabres, but language, law, and liberal.
Filmmakers were accused of treason, more or less, in their judgment on India. This 2002 judgment seems far more charitable. But, as always, there will be a voice to challenge each new interpretation.
Even today, I think there's very much a desire in a country like Britain not to be told that key aspects of our past were desperately iniquitous. People want to believe that generally it was all okay, even if some nasty things happened. Well, unfortunately, when you begin to look at the very underpinnings of British imperialism, the underpinnings were often remarkably suspect. So even if some more benign things happened at certain junctures, that really isn't the bit of the story that necessarily should be focused upon. A more rounded story is needed, and I think the tail should never be allowed to wag the dog.
In 2012, Jeremy Paxman cast his critical eye over the empire and wrapped up his inquiry by urging that we re-engage with this critical part of our past.
The sun had most definitely set on the empire. It had taken centuries to accumulate. It was gone in a couple of decades.
The empire brought blood and tears and dispossession to millions of people, but it also brought roads and railways and education.
For good or ill, much of the world is as it is today because of the empire. From the way it looks, to the sports people play, from the religion they practice, to the language they speak. It has changed the very genetic makeup of Britain. If only we can look at it clear-eyed, it can tell us a lot about who we are. It's a story that belongs to all of us.
We've been through pride, we've been through shame. Mostly nowadays we seem to be in denial. But if we really want to understand who we are, it's time we stop pretending the empire was nothing to do with us.
As I've gone through the archive, I've seen historians being attacked by their peers. I've seen filmmakers pilloried in the House of Lords. Wouldn't it be wiser just to steer clear of the empire and stay out of trouble?
Quite simply, it's so full of such astonishing stories that it's a constant source of material for documentary filmmakers as well as dramatists and screenwriters.
And when the pendulum of historical interpretation swings so violently, it means that familiar subjects never lose their appeal.
Ironically, it's now almost as controversial to defend characters like Cecil Rhodes as it was 4 decades ago to denounce them.
It seems to me that the documentary archive demonstrates that there's no historical subject more exciting and colourful, nor more treacherous and controversial than the British Empire. And if it gets people thinking and caring passionately about who we are and where we've come from, is that a bad thing?